Welcome to the Haven Collective. I'm J.R. Foresteros, and this is the Beacon Bit. Today I want to talk about an idea that I've been exposed to in the last few years that I found really challenging, and that is that the crisis that we are facing at our border is in large part a crisis that is of the US's making. It's something that we like to blame on other countries, but really it's something that lies at our feet. There's a really important book that came out last year called Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here by Jonathan Blitzer, who writes for The New Yorker. It's about the long history of the crisis at the border going back to the 70s and 80s and all of that. And early in the book, Blitzer makes this observation. He says, each of the last 3 American presidents dealt with major humanitarian emergency at the border. One came in 2014, the next in 2019, the third in 2021. These were all different chapters of the same story, which went back to 1980. That was the year the US first codified refugee and asylum law, while also deepening its involvement in 2 major civil wars in Central America. The first asylum seekers were escaping regimes the US was arming and supporting in the name of fighting communism. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably had no idea that this was the case, that during the 60s and 70s and 80s, the US was massively involved in multiple Central American governments, often toppling them, instigating regime change, backing a particular party or another, many of which were responsible for awful atrocities, many of which were carried out either with US support, US training, sometimes even with US weapons. And when I first began to learn about this, I experienced a number of different emotions. I was shocked. I felt I wanted to deny that it could be true. Of course, I got angry, and beneath all of that was a deep, deep grief. Now, when it comes to looking at the border today, that's why I want to push back and say, none of that was my fault. I was born in 1980, so I could not vote for even some of the presidents that were facing some of the border crises, like in 2014. I was not voting, right? So there's a way that I want to push back and say this was not my fault. I didn't have anything to do with this. I couldn't do anything about it, and I think that is a response that we see a lot when it comes to looking at the wicked things that our nation has done in the past, whether we're talking about the Atlantic slave trade and the chattel slavery that America instituted, or something like the immigration crisis that we in large part created through our foreign policy actions and then are dealing with the repercussions of today. We want to say, I didn't do that, or even we didn't do that, right? These are decisions that were made a long time ago by people who may or may not even be our actual ancestors, and we are sort of left with the bill, and that doesn't seem fair. Well, that's exactly what the prophet Ezekiel is addressing in Ezekiel chapter 18. Ezekiel is a prophet who lived through the event that we call the exile, when the Babylonian Empire conquered the nation of Judah, deported a bunch of their nobility and leadership, and again, basically created a cultural apocalypse for God's people. Now, Ezekiel is in chapter 18 addressing the children of the people who were the generation of the exile. And the children are basically saying, hey, it is not fair that we have to pay the price for what our parents did. They're not denying the exile. They're not denying that in large part the exile happened because their parents' generation and the generations above them were not faithful to the covenants that they made with God. They're saying, hey, why do we have to suffer for the things that they did? It's not fair. It shouldn't be our responsibility. Does that sound familiar? Because it sure does to me. And Ezekiel's response to them, I find incredibly provocative. He says, you're right. God does not hold you accountable or responsible for the things that your ancestors did. God holds them accountable for that. God holds them responsible for that. God holds you responsible for what you do. So I think when it comes to the border crisis, we can ask the same kinds of questions. We can't go back in time and change U.S. foreign policy. We can't go back in time and undo the chattel slavery system, right? We can't go back in time and combat the genocide against Native peoples. We can't go back and change any of that. But that doesn't mean that a response today is not required from us, because we live in a world that was shaped by those actions. We live in a world where the consequences of those things still reverberates. And so the question that God asks is not, what are you going to do about what your parents did? The question that God asks is, what are you going to do about the situation that faces us now? Because honestly, some of these issues are so big, so complex, so intractable seeming, that I want to bury my head in the sand and just pretend that it's not something I need to deal with. But we know that that is a bad response. We know that that is an irresponsible and unfaithful response, because God calls us to be good news in the face of these crises. And there are things that we can do. I look forward in our Beacon gatherings to talking about what some of those things might be, especially because we're in an election year, especially because the crisis at the border is such an inflammatory issue. And I don't want us to be another generation of Christians who says that our theology and the way that God calls us to be has no impact on how we look at the people at our southern border and the crisis that is there and the needs that are there. I look forward to the conversations with you this week. Until then, grace and peace be with you.